picking up immediately where the previous video installation had left off at, as the People's Armed Police Shock Forces of the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion tasked with carrying out Phase 1 of the operation to capture and clear the city of Midland, as the paramilitary forces located within the heart of the city had to be surgically removed as if they were a cancerous tumor, as the DEA, the IRS, and U.S. Marshals all had beefed up their presence at their locations throughout the city, as they were to be used as filler units in order to supplement the U.S. Army National Guard forces of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team deployed to the area to defend critical infrastructure sites, as the paramilitary forces were to effectively bolster the number of regime security elements in the area, which were sorely lacking, as they would utilize aggressive patrolling in order to patrol undefended areas as a means to effectively stretch out their limited forces. However, as the invasion had begun and communications and ISR capabilities were totally severed by the combination of ASAT, cyber, and electronic warfare assets, as the ASAT weapons had completely eliminated the entire American satellite constellation of military and civilian satellites, while the cyber attacks crippled everything, including the grid, while the electronic warfare assets, including within this primary battle space being the orbiting Y9LG electronic warfare / electronic intelligence aircraft, were effectively jamming radio, radar, and even drone signals in order to prevent redundant ISR capabilities of any kind in the form of portable radars that were generator-powered or in the form of drones, whether commercial or military, as well as also radio-based communications. Effectively, all three systems working in concert had thrust America back into the Stone Age, especially in terms of communications, as there was no way to coordinate defenses effectively from the top down. And now, effectively, it was a free-for-all, and the commanders in local areas had the ultimate say-so, as there was no orders coming from higher up. As the three main combat battalions of the U.S. Army that were deployed to the area were the 1st of the 635th Armored Battalion, which even had sent its Alpha Company to the north of the city of Odessa to its municipal airport to use as a combat outpost due to its location near a major road junction in the area, and its major logistical force, its 106th Brigade Support Battalion, nearby at the National Guard Armory, also in the north of the city. The 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, a combat unit, had been deployed to help defend the ICE Detention Center, which was populated by ICE paramilitary forces, which had been effectively beefed up with Max Pro MRAPs and some heavy weapons in the form of 50 caliber weapons such as Barrett sniper rifles and M2 50 cal machine guns, effectively being the most potent weaponry that equipped the American paramilitary forces in this particular battle space, as the American paramilitary forces were generally far better armed, equipped, trained, and led than were, of course, the armed reactionary civilian forces, which were leaderless, effectively a cluster, a mob of sorts of just armed individuals that varied in terms of their capabilities, their equipment, their training and experience, with no leader, no logistical system to speak of, and really no long-term ability to sustain operations. These armed reactionary civilians effectively had a horrible misconception that this would be an easy fight, and they would sorely find out how wrong they were, as they faced an opponent that vastly outgunned them and was far more technologically advanced and capable and more tactically astute than they were. They would find quickly that their small arms were simply no match for the armored phalanxes, effectively, of the combined might of the PAP's vehicle-based capabilities, their troops wearing excessively strong body armor and Kevlar helmets, as well as also their heavier capabilities in the form of their armored forces, not to mention, of course, the overwhelming advantage in heavy weapons such as field artillery, as well as also air power, as the People's Armed Police could call upon coalition air support in the form of the Iranian Air Force's Su-24 strike aircraft, as well as also the PLAAF's JH-7 strike aircraft, which were slightly even more powerful in terms of their payload weight carried aboard the aircraft at 20,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, while the slightly less powerful Su-24 carried 18,000 pounds, which was still a very significant payload weight indeed, as a single 1,000-pound air-to-ground munition was immensely destructive, and carrying 18 per aircraft was an unimaginable level of destruction if the entire payload were to be jettisoned in one area. With all of these advantages, the People's Armed Police Shock Forces, utilizing their high tempo of operations and their extremely high level of aggression, struck fast and hard against all of their targets, crippling everything in their way with excessive firepower as they rapidly raced off of their CCP regime properties and went straight for the proverbial jugular of the nation, as nobody could effectively stand in their way. Although there were three categories of defending forces located throughout the battle space in the form of the armed reactionary civilian forces, which again were the least capable and effective of the three main categories, while above them were the American paramilitary forces, which were better equipped, trained, and led, and above them were, of course, the American military forces, and of course, the well-armed, well-equipped, well-trained, and well-led American militia forces. As the American militia forces had equipped themselves with weaponry acquired off the black market in copious amounts, as they had wealthy financial backers within their groups, and even the group members in these militias pooled their funds in order to achieve large-scale results. As the battle in the city of Midland was underway, the militia forces that had grouped together to the north and just outside of the city in its outermost fringes at the road junction of State Highway 349 and Big Spring Street, which Big Spring Street was the major thoroughfare that ran through the city of Midland itself and bisected it into two halves, effectively its eastern and western half, as Big Spring Street would be a major key logistical route for the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion as its headquarters and support company, which was responsible for commanding the battalion as well as its logistics overall, would have an open route to truck in logistics to their combat companies, which had both surrounded the city in a cordon or an envelopment, an iron ring around the city, as well as also the combat company that had broken up into its combat platoons to assault the two main buildings, housing a combination of 700 total paramilitary defenders between the IRS, the DEA, and as well as the U.S. Marshals, as again their numbers had been beefed up in order to augment the American military forces in this particular battle space, as these would be filler units to help in patrolling the area and defending key infrastructure from any possible attacks, as the surgical removal of these forces effectively depended upon the rapid action of the Light Mechanized Infantry Company effectively drawn for this task. They had raced into the city, smashing their way through any and all obstacles, and flew into the parking areas surrounding the two buildings in question, as the De Niro Plaza in the far northern outer fringes of the downtown area was on the border of the free fire zone, as it was called, between the ring of steel being created, the iron grip around the city center, and the downtown area, which was generally off limits for the most part to heavy firepower in the form of artillery and airstrikes, although there were some small exceptions, such as the local parks that dotted the downtown area, as well as also the multi-level parking garages, as these civil structures were seen as acceptable targets due to their resilience against artillery fire. These very same types of structures would be used all throughout the course of this 4-day-long invasion in many different parts of the country to shelter military and other forces from coalition artillery barrages, and would be somewhat effective at doing so, although there were very potent bunker-busting munitions, both air-delivered as well as missile-delivered, that could cripple these structures and bring them to the ground. Although in the case of the city of Midland, the parking garages in the city would be shelled, as there would be defending forces trying to take position on top of these very buildings, these structures. As we go to the map of the city of Midland, by 1 a.m., the northwest portion of the cordon being carried out by a single company of the 5 total carrying out the cordon, as one company would take the northwest portion of the cordon, another would take the northeast, and 3 more racing through Big Spring Street would take the southwest, south, and the southeast facing portion of the cordon in terms of the light mechanized infantry companies effectively drawn for this task. As the area would be thoroughly surrounded and the cordon defended to prevent both reinforcements from entering the city inadvertently, as there was no communications between any of these forces, and because there were 3 categories of defenders between the standard armed reactionary civilians that again were leaderless mobs of armed civilians, along with the paramilitary forces with their own chain of command, and also the militia forces with their own chain of command, there was very little cooperation between these 3 different entities, although they did cooperate when they effectively had gotten within close proximity of one another and could effectively communicate. Apart from this, there were friendly fire incidences at times, as it was difficult at times to effectively determine friend and foe in the dead of night, as the standard armed reactionary civilians, many of them lacking any basic night vision or IR capabilities at the very least, would often open fire at anyone they saw in a uniform from a longer distance, as again it was very dark as the grid had gone down, although the PAP did not have this problem whatsoever at all, as all of their forces had night vision and IR equipment, as well as also their quadcopter drones, which all work together to form a massive patchwork of surveillance in addition to their high-altitude surveillance and satellite-based surveillance, all interlocking to map the real-time battlefield as it evolved by the literal second, plotting friendly and enemy positions as they appeared, and removing them as they were eliminated. As this real-time mapping could be seen on the combat data links, both the handheld tablet form possessed by squad-level NCOs and above, as well as the vehicle-based systems, the combat data links. These formed a loop with the surveillance apparatus, as the ISR systems were the eyes and ears of the Sino-Russian AI Combat Cloud, or Real-Time AI Battlefield Data Processing System, which crunched not only the surveillance data, but many multiple other domains of data, and fed it back in real time by the second to the combat data links, as the data was crunched by the millisecond. And again, it was various domains of data at the same time, as China was known to be the world leader in AI and had some of the most capable AI systems in existence. And especially, this was more true than ever in terms of their military capabilities, which also, of course, leaked into the paramilitary domain with the PAP and other Chi-Com paramilitary branches. The PAP, of course, being China's other army, as they were considered the elite, as they were the cream of the crop, as they were effectively those who were the most true of all to the party and its ideals. They served Wei Feng with a high degree of diligence and obedience, as Wei Feng was the new chief of the People's Armed Police, receiving his lateral promotion from defense minister within the Politburo to the chief of the PAP, as his PAP would carry out his genocidal ambitions for the colonization project post-invasion. These were the most ruthless forces within the Chi-Com security forces, as the PAP were the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime and carried out all orders to the letter with little to no regard whatsoever at all for formalities such as the Geneva Conventions and basic humanitarian law, as again they played by their own rules and carried out their operations with a high degree of fanaticism and brutality, as they slaughtered any and all opposition in their wake. As the battle was again already underway by 1 a.m., with the encirclement operation happening simultaneously to the two building seizure operations against the combined total of 700 paramilitary forces, as indicated by these triangles, which were caught up within the iron ring created around the city, the ring of steel, effectively, by the combat companies of the light mechanized infantry. As their buildings were being assaulted, they were being surgically removed from their positions within the city by the combat platoons of People's Armed Police that had been designated to carry out this surgical strike against these buildings, as they smashed their way through the parking area, smashing into vehicles and pushing them aside as if they were nothing. They deployed their troops close to the buildings, and as they emerged from their armor personnel carrier WZ-551s and their infantry fighting vehicle versions, they now received heavy fire support from both their turret gunners on the very powerful W-85 heavy machine guns, which were 12.7 millimeter, as well as also even more powerful firepower from their IFV-based 30mm autocannons, and even also the smaller 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine gun that was mounted just below the 30mm autocannon. This heavy firepower was a literal street sweeper and effectively removed all opposition in the way of the operation to seize control of these key buildings, as the different tactical formations employed would include everything from line formations to double column formations to rolling T formations, such as depicted where the 3 point men in the front, one covered the front 180 degrees, while the two on the side covered upper floors of buildings and roofs, and the others in the back with staggered weapons ensured a 360-degree defensive perimeter around their tactical formation. Others would use their grappling skills with their grappling hooks and grapple to upper floors of buildings to ensure that buildings could be cleared much faster than if they all entered on the bottom levels, as there was constant communication between all of the squads in each platoon as they cleared out these buildings in a high degree of surgical precision. They would move from lobby to lobby, from corridor to corridor, and small hallway to small hallway, small room to small room, office to office, closet to closet, bathroom to bathroom, etc. And they would clear these buildings exceedingly rapidly as they swiftly moved through in their stack team formations, as each squad broke down into 2 half squads to move about the building, tactically clearing the hallways and rooms. As they would breach the building from the outside, they would be under fire from the defenders inside, such as those caught up in the building, including those with heavier weapons such as the Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifles, who would attempt to lay down, covering fire against the heavy vehicles of the PAP, which effectively did nothing to the vehicles, although they were a major threat to the dismounted personnel as they laid down covering fire for attempts to flee the building and retreat, as some were trying to get out of the buildings to save their own lives, as they were realizing that this shock and awe attack left them completely stunned and surprised and without a plan to effectively defend the entry points to their building, as these buildings had multiple entry points as there were many doors and windows, which made it unpredictable where the PAP forces would strike. As we go to the map of the De Niro Plaza area on the far north fringes of the downtown, which was where it bordered the free fire zone of the uptown area within the cordon, this area consisted of a mixture of residential civilian neighborhoods, many small businesses, and office buildings, including the De Niro Plaza itself, as there is a number of streets through this area, such as Story Avenue here, as well as Big Spring Street itself, as in this opening of this map, the last company of the cordon force that was cordoning the city was moving into place at the time of the opening of this map. And just a mile to the south, that same company is moving down Big Spring Street when this map opens up, just a few minutes after the De Niro Plaza map, as this map opens up at 1 a.m. in the De Niro Plaza area, and the map in the heart of downtown where the courthouse and U.S. Marshals building is being under assault, and the post office immediately adjacent in this whole compound is under attack just minutes later, as all of the combat platoons of the company tasked with building assaults had fought their way in to surround these buildings with heavy assistance from loitering munition strikes as the HE warhead-equipped CH-901As that had been fired to assist from the combat drone section within the armored battalion, which would soon send its 5 deployed companies to assist in the clearance operation, its 3 light tank and 2 armored infantry companies, with the remaining combat companies holding the road junction of State Highway 250 and Interstate 20, a major exit and entry point into and out of the city from its east, to prevent any combatants from possibly getting to Big Spring, where the major logistical dump for the resupply operation of the external invasion forces of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army was located, as this had to be protected at all costs, including from forces trying to flee the Midland and Odessa area. Major roads into and out of this battle space were covered by everything from ground forces to loitering munitions and the Wing Loon 2 and 3 dedicated combat drones, as well as also the capability for artillery and air power to strike any potential convoys or groupings of personnel trying to flee the area. Although for the time being, heavy firepower was being diverted to support many of the different operations now unfolding throughout this battle space, including what was now occurring in Midland itself, as the map of the Battle of Midland opens up at 1 a.m. with the encirclement, and the operations to seize and clear the buildings was underway at literally the same time, or within minutes of each other. The fighting was now extremely heavy in both the downtown area and the outer cordon, as a number of small firefights was already beginning to break out, which would lead to larger scale combat as the armored forces would arrive on scene, as more and more armed reactionary civilians fleeing their homes with weapons in hand and whatever personal protective equipment they possessed, if any at all, were now beginning to move about the city, both looking for the enemy, as they had delusions of grandeur that they would have an easy fight on their hands, although they would be proven extremely wrong, as they had literally no advantages, while the PAP held all the advantages in communications, coordination, tactics, procedure, technology, and heavy firepower, as the armed reactionary civilians were the least effective out of all of the defending forces in the area. They would learn the hard way that their efforts would be in vain, although they fought very avidly and they had heart. They would be cut down like lambs to the slaughter, as the PAP forces would move brutally through this area, as they were a crack quasi-elite counterinsurgency force at heart. They were well versed in urban warfare doctrines, as they had not only been extensively well trained in these types of situations, they were also extremely well versed in operations in rural areas, as in the far west of China in the Xinjiang region, they would interdict armed insurgent personnel trying to cross the border, and they would smash insurgent villages and often burn them down even with their terror weapons known as the Type 73 flamethrower. As these brutal forces, with their finely honed skills over the years of training and usage of these tactics and skills, were now employing them directly against an enemy nation and bringing that nation to its knees throughout the course of this campaign. In the southwest of the city of Midland, along the southwest cordon of the ring, created by the arriving light mechanized infantry companies on scene to carry out the cordon, the Watersong Wild Space area would be the scene of another battle, as this area itself was surrounded by industrial areas and buildings, as well as commercial areas and buildings, including even a hotel and convention center, U-Haul rental, car rental, RV shops, and a car dealership in this particular area, while the Watersong Wild Space itself had a stream and ponds and small lakes in the area, as well as also, as Interstate 20 moved through this area, to its south was another lake with scattered woodlands in the Watersong Wild Space. This was a local, large recreational park, effectively, and it had a number of different flora and fauna that the militiamen that would enter the area, alongside of standard armed reactionary civilians, would try to utilize at first to their advantage in order to try to camouflage and maneuver themselves through the area to attack the People's Armed Police cordon forces that were spread out along Older Business 20, as it was called, as well as also where they curved to the north along Midland Drive, alongside of the Hotel and Convention Center, which would come under assault by the PAP, as it had 20 militiamen inside of it, as they had left their technicals outside in the parking area, as well as across the street in the car dealership, which would be destroyed immediately as this map opens up. While others would park in the parking area, having had entered the Watersong Wild Space by taking Midland Drive to the south of the freight rail tracks and Industrial Avenue, which was to the south of the rail tracks, and had entered through the entry point to the parking area. Also, armed reactionary civilians would leave their technicals in the parking lot as well, as they too would move into this area. They would try to coordinate their efforts together with the militiamen, although this would be haphazard at best, as the militiamen were a somewhat well-coordinated fighting force, while the standard armed reactionary civilians were simply not. The fighting in this area would be simply brutal and heavy. This battle against the cordon forces, as they would be attacked from two different sides, from the north in the hotel by militiamen wielding anti-armor weaponry, and to the south from the Watersong Wild Space, which would end up leading to combat even in the industrial sites which bordered the Watersong Wild Space, where the PAP, as well as also the militiamen and standard armed civilians, would fight amongst these industrial buildings and effectively clear these sites in order to return back to their vehicles, which offered them not only protection, fire support in the form of the heavy machine guns and even the 30mm autocannons, as each platoon had an IFV version of these vehicles, but also was a logistical resupply point, as within these vehicles there were additional ammunition crates, hand grenades, 35mm tube-fired grenades, as there was a man in each squad possessing one such tube beneath his QBZ-95 rifle, as well as also ample stocks of Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade ammunition in the form of anti-personnel and anti-armor rounds. And there were even some stocks of HJ-08 ATGMs, as well as also there being an available Type 73 flamethrower, as a flamethrower operator in each squad had the option of equipping this weapon or equipping a QBZ-95 rifle and taking it into battle. However, the Type 95 or the Type 73 rather would be used whenever and wherever possible in this operation, as this weapon was exceedingly effective against groupings of defending forces for obvious reasons. It was a terrifying weapon to have to deal with in the course of battle. Returning to the De Niro Plaza map, there were 200 total paramilitary forces holed up within this particular building, both of the DEA Alphabet paramilitary forces and also the IRS, all of them equipped in their Army-style fatigues of the U.S. Army and their equipment, including their heavier weapons in the form of their Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifles and the M250 cals, which of course equipped their MRAPs, which were parked outside, some of them in motor pool positions in the parking areas as they were lined up and ready for use, and others being actively used, whether to patrol the neighborhoods immediately around these buildings as an extra measure of security, or even parked and deployed around the buildings facing all directions with their M250 cals to prevent attacks from the outside. There were also sharpshooters positioned on the roof, as the De Niro Plaza had 3 full squads on the roof, as these were 2 half squads and these were 2 full squads. At the opening of the map, they would be immediately hit by a combination of loitering munition strikes and fire from below, as the heavy machine gun ammunition would rip right through the upper level of the building and through out of the roof and hitting personnel. The remaining survivors on the roof would ultimately flee for the stairwells for their lives in order to avoid the same fate that occurred with other personnel, as 5 would escape to this stairwell and 4 would escape to this stairwell, surviving the fire coming from below. Although return fire was meted out, ultimately they lost some personnel from their squad, leaving only 4 survivors that escaped in the staircase. This whole squad was totally wiped out by the loitering munition strike, as this half squad was as well. This half squad escaped. As there were already 200 personnel inside of the building, they were putting up the best fight possible, but it did little good against the PAP vehicles, who could return far more rapid and heavier fire against the personnel within the building itself than the personnel could that were in the building firing out of it. While they put up the best fight possible, it would be over relatively quickly, as the PAP forces got close to the building and breached from the lower level, with even a squad breaching the second level of the De Niro Plaza using their grappling skills that were finally honed in training and also used in real life in Xinjiang, as they had deployed these methods against armed insurgents in urban areas holding hostages or other types of crises, and now they were deploying them in battle in the invasion. As they assaulted these buildings with a rapid, devastating, heavy and brutal assault, they would rapidly breach the buildings and fight their way through, as they would also cut down any personnel attempting to flee out of the doors and windows of these buildings, as they left some vehicles and personnel outside according to standard building clearance procedures. In the De Niro Plaza area, as Story Avenue and also Marienfeld Street, there was Waters and Watson Street, there was Cuthbert Avenue, and there was Colorado Street, which also went up in this way, and there was Estes Drive, and of course Big Spring Street. As this map opens up, the last company is moving down Big Spring Street to their cordon position, while the platoons of the lead company had already broken off and set up their positions, as the combat company would be directly supported by the actual headquarters company, which were the command and logistical elements over the company that was split up into 2 platoons for each building. The headquarters platoon, with its powerful MRAPs, which were the strongest vehicles in the platoon, took up a protective diamond formation around the weaker logistical vehicles, such as the soft-skinned Shangji supply trucks, the Type 84 armored recovery vehicle, the armored ambulance, as well as the MV3 Fall fuel truck, with the commander's vehicle, an up-armored EQ-2050, effectively China's answer to the American Humvee, was also equipped with a W-85 heavy machine gun on the turret manned by a gunner. As all of his heavy firepower covered multiple directions, they could watch the backs of the squads that were breaching the building as they had fields of fire covering all directions to the north of the building. To the south of the building, one vehicle and the crew members, or the squad, effectively, that were dismounted, would initially lay down fire against the personnel that were manning this side of the building and on the roof, but would eventually shift position as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the combat data link had informed them that armed reactionary civilians were emerging from local homes in the area, including here on Whitaker Street, and were crossing the brick walls and fences of the backs of their properties and moving amid these small, scattered, wooded areas towards the large parking area just to the south of De Niro Plaza, causing these forces to shift position to engage them to prevent them from assisting in any way, even if inadvertently, the paramilitary forces that were now under siege and being effectively assaulted at this time, as the PAP shock troops moved swiftly throughout the building. As they moved again from lobby to lobby, office to office, corridor to corridor, small hallway to small hallway, room to room. They were extremely methodical in their stack teams as they tactically sweep the building and had the entire building layout, as they had every single solitary building layout within the country available to them through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, so they weren't going in blind. They knew every room and layout in this building and could assault it accordingly, as there were no effective hiding places for any of the paramilitary forces inside. They were quickly swept aside by the overall advantages of the People's Armed Police. Although they fought back vigorously, the fighting in this area would end relatively quickly. Outside of the building, as armed reactionary civilians emerged from local neighborhoods and were now running through the local parks that scattered the area and running across the various streets to try to get into position to engage the PAP forces that they could see. They wanted to get within Molotov range, as there was a small number of these armed reactionary civilians that had handheld gas tanks and empty bottles and even cloth they could put together as a fuse mechanism for their Molotov cocktails and try to effectively hit the PAP vehicles with these weapons. However, they had to get in extremely close to use these weapons, as this was the only effective anti-tank or anti-armor weapon available to the standard armed reactionary civilians. They would again have to get in perilously close to use these weapons and would often get cut down as a result, as their ambushes would end in disaster, as they wouldn't even be able to carry out proper ambushes, as they were already seen by the quadcopter, high altitude, and satellite assets, and the data relayed through the AI back to the combat data links of the PAP, enabling them to already know the positions of the emerging armed reactionary civilians coming out of their homes and effectively coalescing in different areas and trying to attack them. As in this area, there were 5 armed civilian personnel coming out of this home and effectively meeting up with 2 from this home, essentially their neighbors. These personnel were armed in these 2 homes, effectively these 2 different families, and they got together and decided they were going to try to defend their neighborhood against these PAP forces, only to be struck by a loitering munition circling the area with an HE warhead. sending them in multiple directions, riddled with shrapnel, some of them even having limbs blown off in the process. As that was underway, others came from this part of the neighborhood, and as these vehicles and troops shifted position, they promptly engaged them, including with a loitering munitions strike, annihilating the entire group of 5. As this vehicle fled down Whitaker Street, it too would be hit by a loitering munition strike, as this technical was filled with armed personnel from the neighborhood that were trying to flee in their vehicle, only to be destroyed by the strike. These other personnel, too, from this home, left the front gate of their home down their driveway and fled up Whitaker. They too would be struck by an incoming loitering munition, as these 3 technicals, filled with armed reactionary civilians, had moved into the area. Their intent was to carry out an attack on the PAP, as they had been informed of the PAP's presence by fleeing refugees passing through the area, as motorists that were already on the road as the invasion was just kicking off had warned everybody in sight of what was going on and what they saw. These reactionary civilians had it in their mind to try to attack the PAP, only to be fired at by the support troops of the headquarters platoon and the heavy firepower of their MRAPs, taking up the corners of the diamond. Heavy machine gun fire shredding all 3 technicals to absolute pieces, along with the personnel inside. This grouping also came out of this neighborhood and moved around this business. They too would be engaged by the heavy machine guns of the headquarters platoon and its MRAP and other assets, including its dismounted headquarters troops, such as the supply clerks and some of the maintenance troops and others in the platoon. As these 8 personnel moved about the area, they would move through these different buildings for temporary concealment, moving into this office, which would be promptly targeted for a heavy artillery strike coming from multiple 122mm shells from an available firing battery from their artillery battalion within the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as each of the 2 brigades had their own artillery battalion to support their own brigade's operations throughout this battle space. As 122mm shells promptly came in, they flattened and smashed the building and the personnel inside to total pieces. And this would not even be the end of it, as a very powerful airstrike from 2 Su-24 strike aircraft of the Iranian Air Force would likewise join the battle and dropped a heavy payload of munitions on targets below, as more and more armed reactionary civilians moved into the area to challenge the People's Armed Police, as they would try to get into buildings and use the upper floors to fire down at the PAP with their myriad of different firepower, everything from their sporting rifles, which were civilian versions of military rifles, like so, to their hunting rifles, which had incredible stopping power and range, to their simple shotguns, which were effectively only good for operations very close and personal, such as within buildings. But they did have some utility against FPV drones, although FPV drones were not in use in this particular operation. That was about the only good thing a shotgun was effective for in warfare. As it pertained to handguns, some of the armed civilians only possessed handguns and no other weapons, and thus had to make do with these weapons as best as possible, although those that possessed handguns were often never really able to get close enough to use them effectively. Although this was not always the case, it was mostly the case in nearly every situation that evolved throughout the course of this battle. There were even SBRs, or short-barreled rifles, as they were often called pistols in the pistol category by gun shops. They were really effectively just compact assault rifles or sporting rifles. They could fire 5.56 or even in the AK pistol variant, the 7.62 by 39 millimeter rounds. although they did not have the range and accuracy of a long-barreled sporting rifle, they were still more effective than having a real pistol in terms of their combat utility. As armed civilians moved from Lloyd Park and crossed the street, entering this large office building, and others, a total of 8, had moved through their neighborhood just off map and crossed through these businesses and entered this office building, these buildings would soon, within the first 20 minutes of battle, be targeted by this massive airstrike from the Su-24s, as each of these Su-24s would drop a massive quantity of munitions, with this Su-24 dropping a total of 8,000 pounds of munitions total spread out throughout this area, while this Su-24 would drop 6,000 pounds spread throughout this area, and artillery strikes would also come in on these buildings as well, even before the airstrike, as these 3 technicals in the far northwest of this map coming down the street as they were actually fleeing from the outer encirclement ring that was happening at about the same time as this fighting was occurring, would come in and ditch their trucks like so and begin to enter nearby buildings as they would go in through the windows, the doors, however they could get in, as they would try to get on these upper floors of buildings, including in these areas, and use them in order to fire down at the PAP forces in the area, as they would exchange limited fire between the headquarters platoon firing back at these buildings. Artillery strikes with high levels of precision were called in through the use of the quadcopter assets, giving precise coordinates to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which sent these coordinates to the FDC elements in each firing platoon of each firing battery, as there were 2 platoons of 8 howitzers each in this particular firing battery featured, and the FDC elements, having all of the correct data, would relay the fire missions to the gun line, who would promptly execute and would shower these buildings in 122mm shells, as indicated by these imminent strike markers, utterly smashing and annihilating these armed civilian forces in conjunction with the airstrike that was now inbound as well. As the Su-24 strike would come in and smash these office buildings to absolute pieces and finish off this building, as this building would already be horribly gutted by the artillery strikes, these paramilitary forces and these gun trucks, these Max Pro MRAPs, will have already been destroyed by a combination of loitering munition strikes moving through the area to hit them on the roofs with HE munitions, as well as also firepower from the IFVs of the lead platoons of the last company rolling in. As they passed through the area, they let out 30mm fire on the lead Max Pro MRAP, completely and totally shredding it to pieces, as the 30mm autocannon was simply, in terms of its destruction potential, absolutely devastating against armored vehicles such as MRAPs, as they were considered lighter armored vehicles. They could withstand 50 caliber or 12.7mm fire on the front and sides, but could not withstand anything larger, as 14.5mm and up would completely shred through the vehicle, and 30mm was no exception, as this very powerful, potent round, with its armor-piercing, its HE, and its HE armor-piercing shells, were absolutely devastating against the MRAPs. Firing its HE AP ammunition, the lead IFV versions of the WZ-551s of each platoon would absolutely wreck these vehicles in their gun truck platoon-sized elements as they patrolled the neighborhood, as well as also being joined by loitering munition strikes from the remaining available CH-901As in the area, as the same would happen to this particular platoon of gun trucks of paramilitary forces moving through the area patrolling their neighborhood, as they let loose 50 caliber fire as these vehicles pass through the area. As this map opens, they too would be fired at by the lead IFVs of each column, while the APCs following behind with their still very potent W-85 heavy machine guns, were not quite strong enough to destroy the MRAPs. This would be handled, again, by the IFV's 30mm autocannon, along with the loitering munition strikes from the CH-901As slamming into the tops of these vehicles, completely taking out the threat in the area, even before the airstrike and artillery strikes had entered the battle, again, 20 minutes into the operation. And by 30 minutes into the battle, the entire block would be completely smashed and littered with smoking hulks of different vehicles, including the Max Pro MRAPs of the paramilitary forces and the twisted metal remains of the technicals of the armed reactionary civilians, as this entire block was effectively completely smashed and completely annihilated. No more threats for the time being would come through this area to threaten the operations at the De Niro Plaza, as there was still valuable intelligence to be gathered from within the De Niro Plaza offices of both the paramilitary agencies that were located in the area, as they had gone through the building, which would take about 45 minutes to clear the last of the 200 defenders as they fought vigorously to defend their building on the inside of it, even as they tried to lay down fire at the forces as they assaulted the building. It was no use. By then, the People's Armed Police, in 45 minutes, had completely taken control of the building and was now holding it down and would receive supply drops by their service support company's aviation complement of their flying platoon of Z-8 utility helicopters, as they would fly and drop supplies on the top of the building, as well as collect any WIAs from the combat. However, there would only be a small number of WIAs to pick up after the battle, as the PAP would essentially lose only approximately 10 WIAs in this battle with no KIAs, as the element of surprise and the shock and awe of the building assault was simply too much for the paramilitary forces in the De Niro Plaza, as this effectively was a hard-fought but relatively easy battle in the course of this particular operation to capture and clear Midland. The fighting to the south, a mile away in the heart of downtown, would be a bit more difficult. As we go to the map of the building assault taking place at the post office and court/U.S. Marshals compound, this large complex with both buildings within it, a parking area in front facing north that was along Wall Street here, and along Main Street was the side of the post office, and the southern end of the complex, which was a large parking area for the mail trucks and also vehicles related to the operations of the court and U.S. Marshals. They had established a small motor pool of MRAPs, which again had been already taken out by loitering munition and even strikes from the UCAV, or dedicated combat drones, the Wing Loon 2s and 3s, firing their HJ-10 ATGMs at these targets below, as also the heavy firepower of the single IFV in each combat platoon. Both the platoon featured on the map, and the other featured off-map, cordoning the other side of the parking lot, which is immediately off-map as this building ends here, and there's a parking area. They had flown in, and firing 30mm fire had completely swept the entire parking area of the defending MRAPs, along with loitering munition and ATGM strikes, as the APC versions in each platoon assisted in the cordon of the building to allow the designated squads of the platoon to assault the building. The paramilitary forces that had made it out of the building, some of which had fled south, trying to make it to the county jail, which was literally just off the map and down Main Street. This was a large parking area, and there was a few businesses, including a barber shop in this particular area, just south of these rail tracks, these color-coded in brown, which means they were freight rail tracks that ran through the downtown. This being Front Street / Old or Business 20 here, and moved through the area. There was Lorraine Street right here. It moved north to southbound. This was Big Spring Street on the far western boundary of this map. Indiana Avenue, which led into this large parking area behind these business office buildings. This was a large bank office building here, with under which a street ran under the building itself. There was an overhang connecting the building to this block here. This was Colorado Street right here. And this particular street, again, was Lorraine. This street being Main Street. And then this street was Baird right here. And this was an alley between these buildings on this block right here, this being a single block. And this street that ran east-west here, again, was Wall Street. Within this area, again, sat the complex and a convention center, which would be a site of hiding for a sizable number of armed reactionary civilians fleeing through the area, many of which actually lived in residential portions of the downtown. They were seeking shelter within the convention center. Some would attempt to leave the convention center for the parking garage, numbering a total of 5. They would get on the roof and be targeted with artillery strikes, as again, parking garages were sanctioned for at least artillery strikes, as were open parks that dotted the downtown areas, as they were not a danger to damage or destruction of any of these surrounding buildings in any significant way. An Iranian F-14 would actually be tasked with conducting a strafing mission with their 20mm Vulcan cannon, which was their nose cannon effectively, as this devastating firepower, firing 20mm ammunition at the ground below, would shred through the technicals and personnel and blast them into multiple pieces in many directions, as the strafing operation was destructive beyond all measure to the personnel on the ground. It would rip again through them and their vehicles and send them into multiple pieces in many directions. And as we go to the map of Centennial Park here, and this being the parking area for it, and the pavilion type building here, artillery would also be sanctioned for use at about the same time as the strafing operation would come in to the area, as these technicals, one militia technical and the rest standard armed reactionary civilians, were dismounting personnel in this area as they were trying to make contact to come up with a defensive plan, as the armed civilians were getting out of their technicals and the militia personnel getting out of theirs. The devastating strafing attack and artillery strikes had now come in on the forces below, as the ISR apparatus, which had an iron grip over the entire battle space, had gotten their precise coordinates and sanctioned the use of artillery and the strafing operation from a lone F-14 fighter of the Iranian Air Force's contributed F-14 fighter squadron over the airspace. There were 5 remaining loitering munitions still circling the battlefield looking for targets of opportunity. Some militiamen, a number of 10, were getting out of a manhole cover from the sewer system and were entering this large office building, which had a roof access, as these were roof accesses, small square icons. And these forces, again, were destroyed by artillery, strafing, and loitering munition strikes, while these other forces that had been deployed to defend the outside of the building in terms of the paramilitary MRAPs were again destroyed by a combo of loitering munitions, the CH-901As with HE warheads, the strikes coming in from the UCAVs with their HJ-10 ATGMs, and the firepower of the very powerful 30mm autocannons aboard the WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle versions. As the troops were deployed outside of their vehicles, they would carry out double-column rolling shield operations, and at times, even the squads would split up, with squads to use their vehicle as cover that they could fire from around if need be, while the others would face the other direction to have a full ring, 360-degree security ring around their squad, as they could offer mutual dismounted and vehicle-based fire support to one another, as the heavy machine guns aboard the APCs were more than enough firepower to sweep the streets of dismounts that came into view, as the quadcopters controlled by each squad-level NCO could be operated to sweep the area in conjunction with the other squad/vehicle crews, quadcopters, to map the entire area in their zone of the battle space in real time, sending the information through the AI and right back to their combat data links to advise them in their tactical actions on the battlefield. This was modern warfare. This was how it worked. As the militiamen, some of which again would enter buildings and try to take up positions, these forces would end up being cleared later as the soon-to-arrive combat companies from the armored battalion tasked with assisting in the operation to capture and clear Midland was by now beginning to move into place and set up for their clearance mission into the city, as the 4 of 5 deployed companies would carry out the actual sweep, while the 5th company, being a light tank company of the Type 62G or Type 62 Guy, which means improved light tanks, one company of which would move down the entirety of the big Spring Street from the north of the cordon to the south of the cordon, with their light tanks spread out in a single column with their weapons staggered to cover all approaches in order to prevent both escape to this side of the pocket as it was being flushed out, and also to prevent any inadvertent reinforcements from the other side of the pocket as this side was being cleared, and then would fold in with these cordon forces to act as QRF forces as the last part of the pocket was being cleared by the same armored forces, as they could come in from behind them and get any forces hiding in certain areas like sewers and other hidden areas that they might have been able to escape from. As this would be very important later in the battle, as it would intensify, as the most dangerous forces that would be encountered by far would be these militia forces, who would have far better tactics with their guerrilla style of warfare and munitions with which to carry it out. This again would happen later in the battle for the city. At least initially, things were slow, but were gradually picking up as time wore on. As again, this map opens up barely after 1 a.m., as these operations to seize and clear surgically paramilitary forces in their own buildings was the first stage, along with the outer cordon, to allow the armored forces sweeping in to set up to move through the city simultaneously down all of the streets and clear it, each and every side of each and every street. This is a highly surgical, very thorough operation to clear out the downtown of Midland to achieve the objective of capturing it intact surgically with minimal to no damage done to the major buildings and infrastructure, at least in the downtown area, as these were important for the colonization operations to occur post-invasion victory. For the time being, as it was still early in the battle, artillery strikes now came down upon the paramilitary forces that had been outside patrolling outside of the compound, around the compound, who had entered the parking garage and had gotten to the roof as they had saw their compound under attack. As they had seen this, they entered and got to the roof. 2 Max Pro MRAPs and a dismounted squad, effectively from both MRAPs, dismounting their dismounts, formed a squad, and they all laid down fire on this particular armor personnel carrier and its dismounted squad, who got into a double column formation with one side to watch the building with their vehicle, while the 5 other troops would take position along this wall/fence line and would return fire up at these forces, including with their Type 73 flamethrower and an HJ-08 ATGM at this vehicle. At about the same time, the artillery came in, as this was a priority fire mission to destroy these forces, as they were a direct threat to the surgical operation now occurring to take control of this building and eliminate all armed defending forces inside, as all armed resistance had to be quashed as fast and as efficiently as possible. Within the post office, the 50 personnel of the U.S. Marshals that had gotten into this area had effectively gotten into a heavy firefight with the People's Armed Police, who had breached this particular building to clear it out. course, there were some postal employees inside, some of which even armed with handguns, as many people in Texas were well armed in terms of rifles, shotguns, and even pistols, of course, naturally, and many carried, including this employee, while there were also paramilitary forces in the building taking cover behind anything and everything they could, including sorting machinery and bins and more. Fighting would go on within this building for about 30 minutes, at least inside of the post office, against the 50 personnel and this breaching squad that had entered from the parking lot to the north of the building, while their vehicle would remain outside according to standard building clearance procedures. Personnel on this roof that had taken up positions as sharpshooters had long since been wiped out by a loitering munitions strike, as they were a priority target because they were on a highly elevated platform, being the roof of a building, as high positions were seen as high priority targets for loitering munition strikes naturally because they were dangerous in terms of any possible sniper activity, anti-tank weaponry, or even air defense weaponry, or in the case of armed civilians, even Molotov cocktails. They had to be wiped out rapidly, including those on the top of the U.S. Marshal/Court building itself right here. They too were wiped out as they had come up through this roof access point, just like this half squad had from this roof access point. Vehicles already being eliminated again by different types of firepower would see a half-hearted counter-attack as the buildings were being cleared, coming from a grouping of 35 total armed civilians coming up from the south, as the county jail was just to the slight south and west and off this map down Main Street. This being a large parking area with these paramilitary forces trying to flee to get to the county jail, but trying to flee and take temporary shelter in buildings and amid the cars. They were seen and hit by potent artillery fire coming in on this building and on these forces as they got off the map. They too were hit and shelled relentlessly by 122 millimeter shells, as this particular squad and vehicle of the same platoon holding this portion of the cordon would send its squad in to the building from the southern entrance here, as they would go in through the courthouse and U.S. Marshals complex. This squad would come in from the north after the threats on the roof had been taken out, and as the vehicles would defend from the outside, these personnel on the other side of this fence, as the quadcopters were still running circuits through this area, they of course were naturally seen, and fire directed at them, some of it ripping through the wall and hitting these personnel immediately as the map opened up, as 3 were immediately taken out, with the remainder fleeing into this building and then fleeing between these 2 buildings through this tight area here before fleeing into the parking area, where they would join these 5 personnel on the roof when the shelling happened, as mentioned earlier. As so many things are happening at near about the same time, it's difficult to convey them in any rational order, but as always it will be attempted, as these maps, like in real life, contain multiple actions occurring at near about the same time. As buildings were now in the process of being cleared, with this building being cleared in 30 minutes, as in terms of the post office itself, the neighboring and immediately adjacent court/U.S. Marshal's office, with 100 defenders inside, was under assault from the south and the north as the PAP squads breached the building. As they would move through in their tactical stack teams, eliminating the threats inside, they would take this particular building in just under an hour, as it would take them approximately 50 minutes to clear this particular building from the 100 defenders that were holed up inside. Heavy fighting was underway in the building and outside of it, as there were also militiamen that had taken up position in this parking area to the south of Indiana Avenue. As these vehicles came by of the last company, as again, it was the same company that came through this map when it opened up. They were rapidly in this area as this map opened up, as their remaining 2 platoons were moving through. They laid down fire against these militia forces who had tried to ambush them from their technicals using heavy machine gun fire from their M250 cals, as well as also rocket-propelled grenade fire from their equipped PSRL-1, American-made rocket-propelled grenades, again siphoned off of Eastern European stocks by shady Eastern European arms dealers in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, and sent back with many of the other weapons that equipped these militias, as they were acquired through their own straw buyers from the cartels, who happily did business as they were all about money and nothing else. As there was no honor amongst thieves, they readily did business with even those they considered as their enemies. As these forces were already under fire as they passed this building, this bank building, there were 20 armed civilians that had made it into this building, as this building would not actually be hit by artillery or airstrikes because, again, this was off limits except for parks and parking garages to only mainly artillery. They would throw Molotov cocktails and lay down fire out of the window, but they would miss these vehicles. But they would hit them with small arms, but they would miss with the Molotovs as the vehicles rapidly raced by. While these forces fired RPGs and machine gun fire, the machine gun fire would hit the vehicles, but the RPGs would also miss as the timing was off and flew between the vehicles as they were somewhat spaced out. But they returned fire and shredded these personnel to absolute pieces, and even one of the 5 remaining loitering munitions struck one of the technicals as well, taking it out and the personnel around it with the HE warhead as they made it to their cordon position while these building capture and clearance operations were well underway. As the fighting was now growing heavier, minutes later, as these operations began around 1 a.m. sharp to capture and clear these buildings, there would still be tiny groups of militiamen and armed civilians holed up in this particular area, as there would be some still within the convention center, which would be a problem later as the armored forces would come through to the north, clearing out the heart of downtown, as they would be taking the City Hall itself, which actually lay to the north of this particular map a bit later. And there were still militiamen in these buildings in this area and other armed civilians that were holding out in the buildings and would have to be cleared. As these forces would hold their position, they would be supplied by air, just like in the De Niro Plaza, as a Z-8 utility helicopter would come in to collect the KIAs and WIAs and deliver supplies. As this would happen, some of the KIAs and WIAs from the fighting in this area would number approximately 5 KIAs and about 12 WIAs. As all of this was happening, the battle happening to the southwest that was occurring in the Watersong Wild Space would be happening approximately 20 minutes after 1 a.m. as this battle begins at that time. By this time, the cordon was firmly already established, including in this southwestern portion, and the vehicles were well spread out in this area, as this area consisted of Wall Street, Midland Drive, which also continued on this side of the tracks, and Old 20 or Business 20 and Industrial Avenue to the south of the tracks. There was also County Road 104. There was Hams Road and Stokes Avenue in this area. There are many oil field related businesses, a gas station, the Watersong Wild Space, and again, the hotel and convention center, U-Haul, and vehicle rentals in this particular quadrant of this particular battle space. This map, too, like the others in this particular portion of the battle, being 1 mile east-west by a single kilometer north to south, as were the maps of this downtown area with the marshals and the northern fringes with the De Niro Plaza. In this particular portion of the map, the Watersong Wild Space was about a kilometer in total width and roughly 500 meters north to south between a southern boundary with I-20 and its access roads here, being I-20 right here, and its northern boundary with the oil field related businesses and Industrial Avenue. In this area, in the parking lot that was located just off the Midland Drive entry point, would see militia and armed civilian technicals parked in this particular area. As these forces were coalescing in the Watersong Wild space, effectively, they now had disembarked from their various vehicles and had moved into position amid the wooded areas in this particular portion of the map, as there would be fighting in these areas between the PAP shock forces of the light mechanized infantry and the militiamen and even armed civilians were now beginning to try to work together to counterattack the People's Armed Police. This battle in this area would be relatively short-lasting, as if it were possible, if the forces to the south of the cordon could have coordinated with the forces just to the north and within the cordon, including in the hotel and convention center and car dealership, they could have coordinated a somewhat more effective counterattack against the outer cordon, though it would have likely still failed due to the PAP's firepower and technology advantage. They still could have claimed more casualties than they otherwise did, as a number of different tactical movements would be occurring throughout this particular fight, as again, this particular battle begins 20 minutes after 1 a.m., while the fighting to seize the buildings and surround the area itself, as it had already been surrounded by 1 a.m. The battle here begins at 1:20 a.m., as the fighting to capture De Niro Plaza, as well as the airport in the northwest and the marshals and courthouse, all began at 1 a.m. as the encirclement was underway and the building clearance happening simultaneously. This battle now has began near immediately after 1 a.m., as it was now 1:20 a.m. The spread out vehicles of this platoon and a portion of this platoon, as there were two more vehicles spread widely out north and off this map, were now securing their portion of the battle space and would end up deploying squads outside of their vehicles, as they were now fully aware of the presence of both armed reactionary civilian technicals in the area, in conjunction with also the technicals belonging to the militia forces, as they had parked in the parking lot and disembarked their forces. As they tried to communicate and coordinate effectively with one another, they would effectively lose track of one another in the Watersong Wild space as they broke into smaller groups, and as they were in smaller groups now, would have a harder time communicating over the longer distances, as they would need to use runners, but this would become exceedingly difficult, as by now the loitering munitions honing in on their technicals were hitting them in the parking area and completely destroying them rapidly. While this squad-sized element of militiamen and this squad-sized element of militiamen would move for these buildings, as the color coding is very slightly different between armed reactionary civilians and militiamen, as this was cyan-colored and this is more of a pine green. The militiamen would move into these two oil field-related plants, as this was a chemical plant and an oil field valve company that were right next door to one another. The PAP squads from this platoon would deploy their troops to clear buildings on either side of their portion of the cordon. As the car dealership would be cleared, these vehicles already destroyed by strikes from loitering munitions before this map even opened up, as the militiamen had already pulled in and gotten into the hotel and convention center at the same time as this event was happening, where the area was being cordoned. The fighting would now occur where this squad of PAP would cross the tracks and bound into this position here, while these armed reactionary civilians flew into this area as they emerged from the woodlands, trying to get to the next patch of trees, while this grouping was coming from further south to get to this pond or lake, where they would exchange fire with the PAP vehicles, while the squad had moved into position and they had not effectively seen it happen. They would take fire from directly north and from the northeast, as this wedge formation laid down fire in this direction, as well as laying down fire at these personnel trying to get into this building. As this vehicle came under attack, as a grouping of 10 armed civilians moved along the tracks and laid in position, laid down fire, this vehicle and this vehicle would lay down an L vector of fire tactically and shred these personnel to pieces with 30 millimeter autocannon fire from this IFV and also 12.7 millimeter fire from this APC of this other platoon that was now curving up the Midland Drive in this particular area near the hotel. As the squad members behind the vehicles had also been deployed to exert their additional firepower against the forces on the other side of the tracks, they would shoot back with small arms fire, light machine gun fire, as well as 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades, and also rocket-propelled grenades of their Type 69 variety with the anti-personnel fragmentation rounds, as they would fire back and hit the armed reactionary civilian threat, completely eliminating them in a matter of minutes in a short firefight. The fighting in the wild space itself was far heavier, as there were far more opponents to contend with, trying to take cover amid the trees and woodlands throughout this particular area. As the militiamen, by far, had better coordination and firepower available to them compared to the simple militiamen, or the simple armed reactionary civilians, rather, that were in the area with them. They would fire back with light machine gun fire, small arms fire, and also even general purpose machine gun fire, as some of them possessed general purpose machine guns like M60s and 240 Bravos, which were a bit more powerful than the M249 saws or squad automatic weapons that many of them also possessed. But the saws were still relatively effective weapons, as they had a very high rate of fire. And again, others had PSR-01s and AT-4s, which would contribute immensely to the fighting in this particular area, as this squad moving through the area and the vehicle would be fired at with these weapons, although the squad, fortunately for them, would be missed by a PSR-01 AP round that would slam into earth in front of their position. There would be an anti-armor round that would slam into the side of this APC and do some damage to it, although not completely take it out of the fight due to where it was hit on the front side towards the front of the vehicle. While the vehicle would return fire with 12.7 millimeter fire, it would shred these armed civilians to pieces relatively quickly, with the fire coming from the wedge formation, as the southwest-facing side of the wedge would tear these forces to pieces as they gradually bounded into position, while this squad had, in a line formation, breached this building on this industrial site and had rapidly moved through and cleared it, and would use it as a fighting position themselves to lay down fire against the militia forces that had made it into this building, and they would exchange fire back and forth as this squad breached this building, and this militia group, squad-sized element, breached this building. They would all exchange fire with one another, and this would be a heavy fight between the forces in each of these buildings, exchanging light machine gun fire, rocket-propelled grenade fire, 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades, even HJ-08 fire, as two HJ-08 ATGMs were brought along by the two squads in these buildings, while the Americans returned fire with their heavier weapons in the form of their PSR-01s, AT-4s, and NLAWs, as they had a few of them available as well. And the buildings would become greatly damaged in the fighting, but eventually, as supporting fire was laid, the squad would breach this building and would move through it and clear out the defenders inside of it quickly. As they would move on to the next building with covering fire and the squad outside according to building clearance procedures, they would clear this building out as well from the squad-sized element, as heavy fighting would occur within the building, as these forces had taken heavy withering fire from the heavy machine gun aboard this APC of armed civilians that fled to this position right here. They would be finished off by these bounding and covering squads laying down fire upon them as they bounded and covered into this area, where they would switch positions, and as these forces had earlier been eliminated in the buildings, they would now engage with this group who had by now moved into this position and shifted position as fire was beginning to be laid on them by the bounding and covering People's Armed Police squads as they bounded and covered to attack their current position of this squad. Well, this grouping of armed civilians, first moving here, now moved for cover in this industrial building. After the PAP, bounding and covering on either side of this creek, got ever closer, laying down heavy fire as they did shorter bounds, as they would avoid the heavy fire coming from this defending squad of militiamen. They would eventually cut them all down, although it would take some WIAs in the process of so doing, but they would continue their bounding and covering to clear this industrial building along this road here, which was known as Warehouse Road. As they would clear this building of armed reactionary civilian personnel that had entered it, they would brutally sweep the inside of this particular business and clear out the armed reactionary civilian element that had made it inside. As the fighting was heavy in this particular area, the overall battle would last approximately an hour. Even these two armed civilian technicals that were on I-20 trying to escape the area outside of the cordon, trying to flee the city, would be hit by available loitering munitions at the opening of the map. Other loitering munitions would continue off-map to hit other armed civilians that were well south of this particular cordon. As the hotel was being cleared at the same time as the militiamen that were inside of the hotel were putting up a hellacious fight against the PAP shock troops trying to breach and clear the hotel. Eventually, they too would succumb to the heavy firepower of the PAP as they moved in, some with bayonets fixed, and would gradually clear out the building of its defenders that were inside. The PAP had firepower advantages, and the militiamen had very limited heavy weapons inside of the hotel, with the exception of a small number of rocket-propelled grenades. They would eventually succumb to the People's Armed Police building assault against their positions. Although they put up a vigorous fight and tried to return fire against the PAP vehicles outside, which had laid down covering and supporting fire for the troops, the dismounts, to breach the building in a rolling T formation, like so. The stack teams moved about the building, clearing the militiamen out in a highly tactically proficient manner, in a very brutal, high-tempo clearance operation. As the battle wound down, so again, this particular battle here would last approximately an hour, as it took time, even with the high rate of motion, to conduct these operations to sweep the Watersong Wild Space area and the buildings that surrounded it. As these two squads cleared out this building, and the quadcopter assets and high altitude and satellite assets had seen no more resistance in the general area of this cordon, these two squads would return up Warehouse Road, cross the railroad tracks, and return to their vehicles, as they would bring their WIAs and KIAs along with them, as they had some WIAs and KIAs, and there were even some in the assault against the hotel. A medevac flight would be flown in to the hotel parking area to pick them up in relatively short order, and would even drop off supplies, as none of these flights were wasted. Supplies would be inbound and KIAs and WIAs outbound as these operations evolved. For the time being, this area had been firmly held and had effectively been, in terms of resistance, fully eliminated and brought under complete control of the cordoning company in this particular zone, as the Watersong Wild Space had now been fully cleared and the iron grip around the heart of the city was maintained, even relatively early on. The armored forces arriving on scene outside of the eastern portion of the cordon were now getting into their particular configurations for preparing to clear out the city. As again, the two light tank companies tasked for the clearance operation would break up into single tanks, with the two armored infantry companies breaking up into single vehicles of their companies, whether it was their numerous Type 63 armor personnel carriers following up behind a light tank, or whether it was their platoon's single infantry fighting vehicle, which was a Type 86G with a 30mm autocannon, a short-range HJ-73C ATGM, and a 7.62 by 54mm coax. The powerful machine gun turrets aboard the APCs still wielded heavy firepower in the form of the W-85 12.7mm heavy machine guns, and the dismounts would defend their vehicles and add to their overall firepower in terms of their protective rings around their vehicles, as they could offer mutual infantry dismount support with their vehicle-based firepower support as they would move through and clear the city in a highly tactical and methodical manner. As they now prepared to sweep the city, more and more militiamen and also increasingly armed reactionary civilians were getting into position, as they were now in greater numbers beginning to flee their homes with weapons in hand. And again, it was starting to become somewhat chaotic. There was some friendly fire incidences, as again, the three different groups were effectively running into one another at times, and not fully being aware of the other's presence, assumed wrongly that they were enemy personnel and opened fire against one another, as this friendly fire would cause some devastating casualties among the defenders. All in all, they would do their best whenever they would run into each other in an effective manner to coordinate their actions together, as they had half-heartedly tried to do in the Watersong Wild Space. But the resistance would soon solidify in this battle, as the areas in the city would begin to be swept by the armored forces, including later, as these streets here had icons for the incoming pairs of vehicles of the armored forces that would move through this area starting at 3 a.m. and onward into this battle. To the north of this area, and in the north of it was the city hall, and to the west was where the armored forces were preparing, and there were forces attempting to flee the cordon from the side of the pocket, and they would end up in a small unit engagement, getting into a battle with the assembling armored forces and the cordoning light mechanized infantry forces. This would result in a devastating lopsided battle where the defenders attempting to flee would be viciously cut down, as the PAPRD saw them coming again from a long distance away, as they had a total ISR grip over the entire battle space. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, the assembly point of the arriving armored forces from the armored battalion will be covered as a battle would unfold to the east of the cordon around the heart of the city, as militiamen and armed reactionary civilians and even local police, which would be considered paramilitary, would attempt to fight the assembling People's Armed Police armored forces alongside of their light mechanized infantry brethren, holding the line in terms of the envelopment. This, again, would be a devastating, lopsided, one-way battle where the PAP would have, of course, an overwhelming advantage due to their extensive iron grip in terms of their ISR capabilities over this battle space. Also, the clearance of the very heart of downtown itself, containing the city hall, will also be covered, followed by the clearance of the far western half of the pocket after the eastern half is cleared initially first, leading to the capture and full control of the city later by the People's Armed Police, whose propaganda platoons would decorate the city in red in the very literal sense. And the new ruler of the subdued nation, Comrade G himself, would also be a formal part of the decorations, as the subdued within the nation would see their new ruler and would realize that from now on things would be done his way, as he would run things. More to come in the next video.